would help if I unmuted. Good morning, everybody. My name is Amanda Melcher, and I, with Leanne Romaine, will be your moderators today for our panel. The virtual event is hosted by ACRL Instruction Section Teaching Methods, our discussion forum. Today's topic is Gendered Labor and Library Instruction Coordination, presented by Veronica Ariano Douglas and Joanna Gadsby. The event will be recorded, and a link will be sent out after the session, so if you want to come back and re-listen to it or share it, it's a link to use. Today's format is going to be pretty straightforward. Our speakers will present for 20 to 30 minutes, after which there will be a question and answer session. At that point, Leanne will follow up with any questions from the chat box that have come up during the presentation, as well as from those in the audience who want to ask a question and probe our speakers' great thoughts. So any questions before we get started? All right, in that case, I'll go ahead and we'll move along. Let's see if I can get the slide going. There we go. All right, so our first speaker will be Veronica Ariano Douglas. She is a reference and instruction librarian, as well as an instruction coordinator at St. Mary's College of Maryland. She's an active member of ALA and ACRL, has been both an ALA Spectrum Scholar and an ALA Emerging Leader. She writes about issues related to critical information literacy, student learning, libraries, and relational cultural theory on her blog, Libraries Plus Inquiry. Our second speaker is Joanna Gadsby. She's the instruction coordinator and reference librarian at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. With 19 years of teaching experience, Joanna provides research and instructional support for students and faculty, as well as providing management and coordination for the instruction team. She's also written about topics related to reference services, librarian identity, and social justice. All right, and now I will go ahead and hand it over to our amazing speakers.
Thanks, Amanda. This is Veronica speaking. I am going to go ahead and share our screen so that we can get our slides going. Aha, success. Okay, well, thank you, Amanda, for the introduction, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. This is a topic that means a lot to both of us, and we're hoping that you're here today because this is also an issue that means a lot to you. So many of you may be instruction coordinators, instruction librarians thinking of moving into coordinator work, or managers or supervisors of instruction coordinators. So our hope for our time together today is that we'll be able to share some of the structural issues that we believe affect instruction coordination work and the ways in which this work is gendered and the implications this has for the people who are in these roles.
Hi, everyone. This is Joanna. We'd like to get a sense of what comes to mind when you think about instruction coordination, or how you would describe the work of instruction coordinators. So if you want to put some thoughts into the chat box, we'll give you a moment to do that and look over those before we go to the next slide. Seeing some interesting comments come in through the chat box. I'm not sure if all the attendees can see those, but there's a lot about scheduling, organizing, planning, managing relationships, facilitating, herding cats, exhausting. A lot of good comments coming through. So we'll keep reviewing those as they come through. Again, really appreciate the comments that you're adding to the chat box. This is a really common position in libraries and often goes by different names: instruction coordinator, information literacy librarian, education manager, etc. This individual may be responsible for developing pedagogical training, coordinating information literacy curricular integration and assessment, training, teaching librarians, as well as teaching. But today we're not going to talk about how to be an instruction coordinator. This is not that kind of presentation. Instead, what we will be doing is analyzing the position of the library instruction coordinator using a feminist theoretical framework lens. So our project started as a series of interviews with library instruction coordinators, and through that we began an exploration of the nature of coordinator work, the value of relational activity in academic libraries, and the role of gender in library leadership.
So really it was our experiences becoming instruction coordinators that inspired Joe and I to pursue this project. Like a lot of people who end up in this position, our job responsibilities and our title changed, but our compensation, our teaching loads, and all of our other workplace duties remained the same. They were just added to. So we talked about this a lot with one another, mostly just to make sure that we weren't feeling crazy and we were actually experiencing the same things. And as the time went on, we recognized that something was just really not right. And we felt that it kind of went beyond just simple job dissatisfaction. And we weren't really regretting taking on the position. We just felt like there was something fundamentally wrong with the position itself. We both thought that the responsibilities weren't matching up with what was needed to make the instruction coordinator position an effective position. So I started dealing with the stress and frustration I was feeling about this position in the way that I always do, which is like I pick up a book to start reading and distract myself. And at the time, I was in this really deep feminist revival for another project I was working on. And I was reading a book called Women's Growth in Connection, and it introduced me to relational cultural theory. So this particular theory states that human beings grow in, through, and towards relationship, and that kind of contemporary Western models of human psychological development suffer from the same sexism that exists in our world. Judith Jordan was one of the contributors to the book, and she emphasized the importance of relational activity or cultivating relationship in women's development and empowerment. And also in that same book, scholar Irene Stiver wrote on the psychological impact of gendered expectations of women at work. And then there was another scholar who was writing named Joyce Fletcher, and she kind of combined all of these ideas on a study on the erasure of women's efforts at work. So her research emphasized that workplaces are rooted in a masculine bias. So it not only favors doing work in a particular way, but it really actively excludes, or the way she phrases it, disappears, more feminized relational types of work. And it was through Joyce Fletcher's writing where we really started to get the words that would describe the unease that we felt about instruction coordinator work. And Joe and I started to hypothesize that the problem was with the structure of the position as well as the feminization of the expectations and work attached to the position.
We think it's worth spending a little time examining the workplace as a social construct. That will help us rethink the way that we approach work in libraries around instruction coordination. Gender scholars argue that the workplace is fundamentally gendered. It is shaped by the same expectations, unconscious biases, and stereotypes of men and women that have created the world in which we live. You'll notice that this sets up a gender binary with no space for anyone with more fluid identities and behaviors. So within this gendered workplace, any kind of work that matches society's ideal version of man is coded as masculine labor and is assigned greater value than feminine labor or work in behaviors more closely associated with women. Feminine labor is expected of women at work and is overwhelmingly relational. These are activities like mentoring, helping, supporting, etc. The problem then becomes that because these behaviors are seen as feminine and expected of women, they're taken for granted and aren't seen as real work. We've all heard the phrase soft skills enough times to know that relational work isn't taken seriously. And what's extra frustrating is that research shows that men, both as employees and managers, are more positively viewed when engaging in both feminine and masculine coded behaviors at work, while women are either ignored or viewed negatively for engaging in either type of behavior. So it's a lose-lose.
Okay, so after that super depressing picture of the workplace in general, we kind of want to turn to libraries in particular. So we would hope that in a female-intensive profession like academic librarianship, that gendered expectations and biases would not exist, but of course they do. A colleague and librarian, Jessica Schomburg, states that our profession may be highly feminized, but it is not feminist. The same androcentric workplace values permeate the library and academia at large. Lisa Sloniowski, in her writing, characterizes libraries as an extension of the domestic sphere, and therefore it's a workplace that's acceptable for women to work in because of its focus on caretaking and service. The problem is that this kind of service work is not valued at all. Roxanne Shirazi calls out this erasure of our work as shadow labor. So she states that we make knowledge production possible, but our own intellectual work and effective labor are largely undervalued and erased. And instead, what is emphasized is our support role, or the idea of librarian as service provider. What we're doing in librarianship is what Roma Harris refers to as aspiring towards a masculine ideal in order to gain greater prestige. As a profession, we value specializations and skills that are traditionally classified as masculine. And these are things like library administration and tech-intensive positions, all of which are still disproportionately occupied by men. So I'm sure all of us have seen post after post for entry-level teaching librarians with low pay and lots of responsibilities. But when do we ever see the early career equivalent of these postings in scholarly communication or UX or web design or systems? The idea is that women's work or relational work, which is tied to specializations like teaching and outreach, is easy or can be easily learned, but that these other jobs take, quote unquote, real skill. And this, again, we think is just a case of our profession disappearing relational work and not acknowledging the work and skill that goes into it. Library administration itself is also subject to the same gendered expectations in other workplaces, with libraries valuing managerial experience over leadership ability, undervaluing feminized behaviors like caring, collaboration, empathy, and consensus building, and overemphasizing strong, decisive action and vision. In other words, it's this kind of idea of the leader as the hero rather than the maintainer. Some librarians like Maria Accardi, Shanna Higgins, and Foxon Olson have responded by advocating for a feminist practice of librarianship, but it has yet to be adopted as a profession-wide ethos.
So where then exactly does this leave instruction coordinators? Their responsibilities are both inward and outward facing. They are subject to the gender expectations, biases, and structures both within their libraries and more broadly in academia. Their ability to affect change is hampered by a lack of authority, as they usually manage a program, but not people. As part of this effort, they must educate and convince colleagues who they do not supervise to work in the best interest of the library's instruction program. The work of instruction coordinators is all about cultivating relationships, which has traditionally been feminized labor and occurs in the already feminized specialization of teaching. We would then expect instruction coordinator work to be undervalued in academic libraries and set out to investigate this idea in our study. We wanted to learn about the job roles, responsibilities, and lived experiences of academic library instruction coordinators, And we contacted 19 potential coordinators at 17 different colleges and universities in Maryland. Out of these 19, 8 participated in semi-structured online interviews during which we talked about their official and unofficial job titles, duties and responsibilities, their day-to-day work, their challenges and opportunities and their job role, and perceptions of information literacy and teaching both in and outside of the library. Afterwards, we analyzed the transcripts once to identify major themes, and then a second time to code for instances of relational activity, which included any indication of an expression of empathy, mutuality, reciprocity, sensitivity to emotional contexts, empowerment, team building, and support of both people and projects at work.
So the overwhelming finding from our study was that relational activity is at the heart of instruction coordination work. All but one person who we interviewed emphasized the importance of collaboration and relationship building to the position, both within the library and with non-library faculty. Interview subjects were constantly aware of the emotional context of different workplace scenarios. One coordinator went into great detail about the need to read colleagues while trying to distribute teaching workloads. I care deeply that my colleagues feel I am being fair, this particular person stated, and continued to describe the complexity of navigating relationships with other teaching librarians when the coordinator was no one's boss, this person's colleagues were reluctant to teach, and the coordinator was a more junior member of the library. 3 other interview subjects reported a similar need to read the room when interacting with other often senior colleagues who at times devalued teaching. So again, these were individuals the coordinator did not supervise. The phrase balancing act was repeatedly mentioned by one subject who admitted to not wanting to step on people's toes, but also not wanting to get extra work in the form of additional teaching-related duties. It was clear from our analysis that this kind of work is extremely difficult to quantify. In a profession that's set on demonstrating its value, this kind of emotional labor is erased from statistics and assessments. And this is really obvious in the support and mentoring role that many coordinators adopt. One subject who served as a direct supervisor to their teaching team expressed a great deal of empathy and compassion for new librarians in the form of frequent check-ins, having an open door policy, and really extensive mentoring. The role of mentor and the work of empowerment featured much more prominently when the coordinator was responsible for individuals new to the field. This is a really very much an all given, no take situation. It's rewarding for the librarian serving as a mentor, but takes a lot more time and effort than supervising established professionals. And again, how is this quantified and how is this reported?
So all of this relational activity is a heavy form of emotional labor. It requires an individual to manage their own feelings, desires, and wants in order to create the right frame of mind and emotional state in other people. In this case, the instruction coordinator must create a sense of buy-in from other teaching librarians for the sake of the information literacy instruction program. Within the greater college or university community, the instruction coordinator must be prepared to be, as one person put it, the face of all things information literacy on campus. This often means working to support the library's instruction program and the integration of information literacy into the greater college curriculum. The people that we interviewed all expressed doing some form of advocacy work for their teaching program and librarians. One respondent describes her efforts to be placed on a number of campus committees and then, after serving for a few years, transferring those responsibilities to other instruction librarians. I see myself as starting those relationships and then figuring out who fits where. This requires a high degree of emotional work. The coordinator is fitting people into relationships and is also always on and plugged into the life of the college or the university.
So working for the good of a program and other people often means doing a tremendous amount of administrative work. And that was really clear in the responses that folks had to Joe's question earlier on in the presentation. So all of the people who we interviewed did some combination of scheduling and assigning classes, administering classrooms, enforcing instruction policy, responding to professors, and compiling and analyzing statistics. This work is extremely time consuming, and it doesn't have the same kind of payoff or sense of accomplishment as other work. It's tedious, it's thankless, and that fact was not lost on the coordinators we interviewed. One person stated, "I look up at the clock and it's 11 a.m. and what have I done? Nothing." The work of library housework is not high on anyone's priority list, but it's really essential for the instruction program to run smoothly. In many ways, it's equivalent to office housework, the invisible labor that's done so that others can live and work comfortably. Those that benefit from this work are completely unaware of the amount of time and effort that went in to make their lives easier. In addition to this, at least one instruction coordinator took on additional classes that other colleagues couldn't or wouldn't teach, and ended up with the bulk of teaching in addition to coordination responsibilities. Again, this work was unremarked upon by colleagues, and some people even expected the coordinator to do this. And this, of course, factors into instruction coordinators' workload.
And that workload is intense. The majority of the people we interviewed were responsible for the same reference and instruction duties as their colleagues, in addition to their coordinator work. The issue of a heavy or impossible workload came up repeatedly, and often the coordinator was doing the same, if not more, amount of teaching as their colleagues. The expectation that the instruction coordinator should take on their fair share of teaching seemed to be ingrained into the culture at some libraries, which goes against the idea of coordinator as program manager. Some relief was available for those whose job title indicated that they led a department or unit, as they were able to then delegate teaching responsibilities to others, but this was often hampered by high librarian turnover or chronic understaffing. One person expressed frustration at not having the freedom to think about the big picture and be proactive because of an overload of teaching duties. Planning and creating a meaningful instruction program takes time, but that doesn't seem to factor into the workload distribution for coordinators. There's also an overwhelming demand for first-year instruction. English composition and first-year experience courses were the primary drivers of the need for coordination, and often the most difficult classes to get other colleagues to agree to teach. Programs that were related to new students, including orientations, resource fairs, and other library outreach, were also overwhelmingly delegated to instruction coordinators. In some cases, the primacy of work with introductory level students also coincided with subject librarians dismissing instruction coordination as less important because of the focus on new students. Often this negativity continued outside of the library. Half of the subjects reported feeling discouraged or devalued by faculty who did not view the library as an educational partner. These anecdotes may sound familiar to you. One person mentioned that some faculty would always use library instruction as a placeholder for their class, and another brought up that some departments think we do a good job of supporting their research needs, but I don't know if they necessarily see us as teachers. In another instance, one coordinator lamented the need to be included in correspondence and events along with other academic program coordinators. This rejection is especially troublesome for instruction coordinators whose very job depends on fostering the kinds of meaningful relationships necessary for information literacy integration and education.
One other issue that we ran into repeatedly was this notion of occupational stress faced by instruction coordinators that seemed to be the result of role ambiguity. And role ambiguity in a workplace context is a lack of clear, consistent information regarding rights, duties, and responsibilities of a person's occupation and how they can best be performed. So this was directly tied to issues of power, both within the library and in the college or university. Only 2 of the 8 coordinators we spoke with supervised other librarians, but all of them were responsible for the health of the instruction program. So there was a lot of confusion over the power coordinators felt they had to create change within their library and within the program itself. One person stated that this kind of quasi-supervisory role was confusing for me, so I imagine it's probably confusing for the instruction librarians. One person mentioned that this kind of position or this kind of problem in the organizational structure works against the continuity and commitment to instruction that our program should have. So although coordinators provide mentoring and teaching support, they don't have the authority and the structure in place that would empower them to make any kind of substantial change in their library's teaching program, at least not without the intervention of a library director, a department head, or someone in some kind of supervisory capacity. Not surprisingly, the people we interviewed consistently reported incidents of colleagues resisting programmatic changes or innovation. And we think this is a huge missed opportunity for both instruction coordinators and for kind of academic librarianship overall. Administrative library jobs emphasize managerial work over leadership experience, which puts anyone who is in an instruction coordinator position at a real unique disadvantage. These people are no one's supervisor. And so now we have this group of librarians who possess a strong knowledge of pedagogy, assessment, academic and faculty culture, as well as the emotional and leadership capacity to foster a collaborative work environment, but they can't meet the basic job requirement that states 5+ years of supervisory experience are needed for this leadership role.
So there are limits to the generalizability of our findings based on our initial interviews. Our goal was to begin a conversation about this job that we share, question the nature of gendered roles in academic libraries, particularly in teaching and learning positions, and highlight the emotional and relational labor that permeates coordinator work. At the moment, we are engaging in more interviews with instruction librarians around the country. Our continuing findings emphasize much of what we've already uncovered. We hope to continue this project by offering recommendations for reshaping coordinator positions in order to empower people in these roles and make sure they are valued appropriately. We hope this will ultimately lead to more effective library instruction programs, better teaching librarians, and also open up new opportunities in library leadership and management for librarians who come from a teaching background. Our female-intensive profession is not exempt from biased frameworks and gendered expectations, and unless we work to actively call out instances of unequal labor practices, our work will never be valued appropriately. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today, and we are happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Veronica and Joanna. This is Leanne. I now open up the presentation to questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and we can start taking them. So from Dale, how many male coordinators, if any, did you interview?
There was just one male coordinator. And even as we continue our work, there's only been one.
Do you have any thoughts on why the coordinators are so overwhelmingly female, maybe aside from some of the information that you presented on?
Joe, do you want to tackle this one, or do you want me to? We've talked about this a lot.
You can start.
Okay. So I am going to liken this to an experience that I've recently been chatting about a friend of mine who's a nurse with. And we find that a lot of the specializations that are better paid or have more prestige within these kind of feminized labor forces tend to have more men in them, whereas teaching, outreach, working with first-year students, the kind of jobs that would ultimately like put you on a career path to be an instruction coordinator tend to be like overwhelmingly occupied by women. So that's, I don't know, that's kind of one theory that we have as to why there are so few male instruction coordinators. Joe, do you want to add to that?
I think what you're saying is a really good point, and that, some of the things that we talked about in terms of the kinds of skills that tend to be more rewarded, both in libraries and in the workplace, as well as who is more likely to perform them, and the fact that people who identify as male often, or cis men, tend to be rewarded for that masculine and that feminine labor in patriarchal constructions of work.
Which answers another question: is, are male coordinators more likely to be promoted?
Yeah, not so much.
I mean, the structure of the position is what's problematic, right? So again, even if men are performing the role of coordinator, the way that it's structured and the way that the skills that are needed and the type of work that's being done is valued and rewarded, it doesn't seem to matter who is doing that kind of work.
Okay. I have a question. Do you have a bibliography you could point us to?
Yes. Yeah, it's in the slides, which we'll
slide deck.
share. But yeah,
Perfect.
We have a pretty intensive bibliography.
Another question is, are there any plans or ideas about how coordinators can connect more formally with each other, because it's very isolating?
Yeah, I know that there is at least one library instruction coordinator group on Facebook. And there is also a Slack channel that was created just for this particular purpose, because so many of us were dealing with the same issues and structural problems at work. And it really is a safe space for us to share resources, get advice, vent when needed.
Excellent. This question: can you say a little more about how the current state of instruction coordination, where workers are mostly female, young, and undervalued, how that state impacts the library leadership pipeline? The questioner says, I still see a lot of library leaders come from public services instruction services because they tend to be more visible, seen as outgoing, etc.
Yeah. Joe, do you want me to do this one, or do you want to do it?
Sure, I have some thoughts, but you
Okay. No, you go ahead. You go first.
Well, we talked a little bit about, that leadership pipeline in terms of what is definitely often required for leadership positions. And usually there's some expectation that you have supervisory experience, that you have some sort of managerial experience that's on paper. And a lot of the work that goes into the management of an instruction program doesn't show up on paper. And, Veronica and I have been talking a lot about that lately, about how to improve that particular documentation and how to include that in an annual report or in an annual review when you're talking about the amount of planning and coordination work that you're doing that doesn't show up as a neat statistic. And I'm getting off track a little bit here, but I think a lot of that has to do with how people are promoted into leadership positions, or how people can even begin to apply for managerial positions that require that kind of supervisory experience that shows up on paper.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I currently am employed by a small college library, and we were looking for a director a few years ago. And I was sort of comparing notes with folks at other small schools because we were noticing that a lot of the applications that we were getting, people who met the kind of supervisory years required, were all coming from like collections or technical services or positions where you actually have an opportunity to supervise staff or other librarians. And very few people who were applying for these director jobs actually had a public services background, which we were all really surprised by and were kind of hoping or thought we would get more of. But we sort of hypothesized that it was probably the kind of years of supervisory experience, because again, that wasn't, you know, an actual like point on their job description.
Okay, the Slack channel and the Facebook group have been shared in the chat box there, and to respond to the question about male coordinators' names, they could participate there or their names could be submitted with their permission, of course. So you can do that on the Slack channel or the Facebook group in the chat box. So the next question is, can you speak more about the overlap between first year or English 101 type instruction and instruction coordinators in terms of your research? You talked about this a little bit, and the questioner would love to hear more.
Sure, I don't mind starting with this one, Veronica, if you want to take over from me in a moment. But one thing that we found with this kind of first year experience course type instruction is often those aren't assigned to a particular librarian or particular liaison department. So they fall into this category of, you know, you either are dividing them up among the whole department or the coordinator is taking that on as, you know, sort of any additional teaching that needs to be done. We saw that come up a lot because it's not tied to a department, and the, you know, many libraries don't have a person specifically assigned to those first year experience courses. And also, in addition, you know, the English 100, 101 type classes also fell into that kind of category where it either wasn't assigned to a particular person or everyone shared it, and then coordinators picked up the slack. And we saw a correlation between, you know, the type of instruction that was valued or quote unquote valued by people who were doing teaching or subject librarians who were doing teaching, that they tended to, you know, coordinators talked about how sometimes people in their department preferred those upper level classes where they could really work in a particular subject area that they had expertise in, and that, you know, those first year type classes, those classes for new students, didn't have as much weight in their mind as being important. So again, there was that issue of value being tied to a particular type of student, to a particular type of class, and coordinators just sort of picking up any of that extra teaching that others either didn't want to do or didn't have time to do. I mean, time is a big issue as well that we noticed because, you know, we all know that there aren't enough people and there are so many classes, there's so much to do. And again, the person who was responsible for managing the program often was the one who was responsible for picking up any of those additional classes that people were overwhelmed by.
Thank you. One of our participants volunteered this information that she has started saving all the emails that were back and forth with Prof each semester. They're put into a folder so that she can quickly count, easily reported, quantifying all of that communication. Again, providing quantifying stats versus the qualifying. Thank you. Another question, were the coordinators that you interviewed considered to have faculty status and tenure equal to that of other faculty members of the university?
Yeah, it was mixed, and it didn't seem to have much of an impact on their kind of day-to-day experiences as coordinators. Obviously, those people who could be sort of more involved on like curricular committees at their college or university had more input into the actual curriculum and the ways in which information literacy could be worked into it. But we just kind of had a mix of people.
Sorry, I'm just reading this. The participant is curious about how we may reclaim and redefine our work from intentional connections to and structuring around the experiences of people of color, non-cis, and or non-heterosexual people. As a queer person of color themselves, they sometimes feel that the practice of emotional caretaking labor and the imperative to lead are deeply interwoven. How might we center these stories towards transforming our collective roles and institutional spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think in part we sort of focused on that binary because that's kind of the ways in which like we are socialized, and that tends to be the way that it breaks down at work. And I think we mentioned earlier in our presentation that doesn't leave space for folks who aren't on one or either extreme of that particular binary, and kind of creates this sort of no man's land or no person's land to be more inclusive for those individuals. I'm looking at the rest of the question. Yeah, I think I sort of agree and sort of don't maybe, that the idea that the practice of emotional caretaking labor and the imperative to lead are deeply interwoven. I think at times they are. I think that the practice of leadership is definitely intertwined with that emotional labor kind of caretaking piece. But the leadership that gets recognized is the kind of leadership that demonstrates some kind of heroic, like some kind of heroic action. Like unless it's a major accomplishment that you can point to, the kind of day-to-day emotional maintenance doesn't particularly get valued. And I think a lot of that has to do, and Joe and I were talking about this yesterday, and I'll let Joe talk more about it, but the ways in which things are valued for, say, our promotion and tenure files, or are valued in our annual reviews, there's no space in there for, I sat down and chatted with a colleague who had a really terrible class for 2 hours and listen to them cry and complain and let them know that it wasn't just them, and offered suggestions, like where do we put that in our annual review? I don't know, Joe, if you want to add more to my ramblings.
No, I appreciate your ramblings, and will ramble a bit myself because I think this is a great question. And, we're looking at this one small piece of the library, but I think these situations translate to a lot of other departments, other roles, other kinds of work that are being done in the library, as well as, on campus broadly. And I think I've seen some, interesting conversations being started about, how do we move toward leadership that centers an ethic of care, and how do we move toward valuing leaders who have that kind of experience and want to talk about those kinds of stories. I want to talk about this kind of conversation, and how does the structure of the university and academia make space for that? And often it doesn't. And I think that so much of doing this kind of work gets those conversations started, and having these kinds of webinars gets these conversations started. And what happens when more of us start talking about this out loud in our institutions, if we feel safe doing so, because so often we don't. And I think finding the people that you can talk to about this, and the spaces that you can kind of co-create, and how can we broaden this movement? How can we, move toward a value of all kinds of work, and, allow people to talk about it in a way that isn't just, in an annual report. And Veronica and I are working on a different kind of project now where we're talking about, we can't stop doing that, I'm not sure why. We're talking about how faculty, teaching faculty and librarians negotiate their relationships with one another. And, you know, it's really interesting to think about all of this within the existing structure of academia and how it doesn't value a lot of the things that we value. And so how do we make space for that? And I don't think that answered your question, but hopefully our rambling gave some sort of inspiration to help people talk about this more. I think like the more we talk about this and the more we find spaces where we feel safe to do so and make those spaces ourselves is really important.
And we have one comment that says there's a lot of similarity in this discussion with writing program administrators and WAC coordinators. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the literature for kind of English composition instructors and writing centers tends to parallel a lot of the things that we talked about today. And then just anecdotally in talking with the writing center assistant director at my college, I mean, it's a lot of the same kind of issues and problems. And I think I don't know, I kind of want to go back to something that Joe mentioned, which I think is like this tie between coordination work and first year instruction. There's something more to that we haven't quite like dug enough into, and maybe that's someone else's research project. But I think in a lot of the interviews that we had, there was kind of this weird divide between instruction librarians, right, and instruction coordinators, and then the subject specialists. And like somehow the teaching that happens with subject specialists is different or more important than what's happening in like first year English comp classes, even though that kind of first year English comp stuff is like the bread and butter. I mean, that's the majority of where teaching takes place, like in libraries. Sorry, that just kind of went off a little bit, but I just wanted to reiterate that.
Thank you. There's another question about were there differences in perception of the value of library instruction and coordinator work if the library director or dean was female or male?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. That did not come up in any of the interviews that we did. I don't think. Joe, did it come up for you?
I don't remember a distinct recognition of saying one or the other. I remember people talking occasionally about that role, the relationship they had with the dean or director, and whether or not they felt as though that person supported what they did. And it didn't necessarily come up, the sex or gender identity of that person in that position. I don't think it came up in a conversation, but I do remember some people talking about how big a difference it made if they felt supported by that person.
Yeah, and the need oftentimes for the director or the supervisor to intervene to get people on board with particular like programmatic changes whenever the coordinator felt at an impasse with the other teaching librarians.
Okay, thank you. How do you perceive the influence of budgeting with the coordinator role? It seems it's a lack of capacity to fund another administrator or manager that perpetuates the necessity for the coordinator position.
Yes. Yes and no.
I think what goes along with that is a willingness to fund those positions. So it's not just that there isn't the money, it's that there isn't the willingness to recognize what kind of position it is. So, and that is again how it is structured, because it's usually added on to a lot of other duties, or because this person is seen as managing a teaching program, which isn't necessarily seen as important work, or I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, but basically it's going to the same place of saying that, I don't think it's valued, and that's why the money is not found to fund it. But, often there doesn't seem to be a lack of funding to find the money to fund other types of positions. So I think you can see where an institution's value lies by how they allocate that budget for positions.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think earlier in the chat box, I saw comments about someone talking about how are we supposed to add managerial duties to this kind of role when there's almost already so much other work to do. And I think our response would be that there shouldn't be all that other work to do. If you're an instruction coordinator, you're planning, you're training, you're mentoring, you're not the person who's in the classroom more than everyone else, but that seems to be the way that these positions are structured. Often those responsibilities get lumped onto somebody who is seen as a really good teacher, and somehow people think that because they're a really good teacher that it must be natural or innate, and they don't put a lot of work or effort into it. And it just, again, structurally, as Joe was saying, kind of makes it an impossible position.
Sorry, just skimming through. Could you talk more about the ethic of care and some elements that would be helpful to see beyond recognition in annual reviews?
Yeah. I mean, I think the ethic of care, for it to make a difference for instruction coordinators, would have to be adopted by library deans and directors, right? If what we're valuing in libraries is relational activity, that's a pretty sharp move away from ROI and demonstrating value. And if that's the case, that permeates the work that everyone does, not just the instruction coordinator. I mean, the instruction coordinator can adopt an ethic of care, but if that's not what's adopted at the leadership level, it doesn't get valued, if that makes sense.
It's got to come from the top down, right?
Yeah, definitely.
What advice do you have for any of us out here on maybe how would we change, or what would alternatives be to our programs that we could reduce or improve the valuation?
Yeah, Joe, do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
I can start. We can go back and forth, whatever, jump in whenever.
Do it.
So I think part of making this work more valued is making it more visible. And I think often that, we do this work and people don't see it, and we don't make it seen. So, the more that we talk about what we're doing, and the more that people recognize what we're doing, it's not just quantifying it on an annual report or in an annual review, but I think it's having more conversations. And in order to work with a team, to have them recognize, I'm doing this work to make the program work, to do these things for you, and and in return we're all working together to make this program work. I just think we need to make a lot of that labor more visible and talk more often. I think about my own program and my own team, and how we tend to talk a lot about instructional techniques, or other kinds of professional development to be better teachers and to think about our students. So we have those kinds of conversations a lot. But I'm wondering if what if when we have a conversation about the work we're doing and how we feel about it, and everyone just kind of talking about what's overwhelming to them. And I think it's great that you're really the person who commented that they're saving all those emails about all the work that goes into working with someone to set up a class, all those times that you email back and forth. Let's talk about that more. And with our teams and with our supervisors and, more broadly, I think like, let's bring some of this out into the open. And I am really rambling. Do you want to jump in, Veronica?
No, this is good rambling. Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree about visibility being important. I think structurally, if there is anyone here, and I don't know that there is, who has a position or is in the position to reshape the instruction coordinator job position or role, is that those positions shouldn't be add-ons. Like, you shouldn't be the liaison librarian to 10 different departments. Oh, and by the way, also we want you to coordinate first year instruction. That position is an important position in and of itself, and there is more than enough work for the person in that position to do. And it frustrates me when I see postings where it's instruction coordinator and reference librarian and outreach coordinator and it's like more ampersands, but not any more money, if that makes sense. And I think that is super frustrating. I also think that there shouldn't be this expectation that the person who's in the instruction coordinator role should be taking on the bulk of teaching. I think for teaching programs to like really be successful, somebody has to be thinking about the program holistically, about training and constantly improving pedagogy, about how your information literacy program fits into your greater institutional curriculum, inroads you can make into co-curricular activities. Like, it's a job. I mean, it's its own job, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
I actually have an interesting opportunity coming up. I am a coordinator, and my instruction team, we're having a retreat to go through what we do and what we want to do. And the interesting thing is that it may change my description as a coordinator. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah, I'll let you know how it goes. We have this wonderful question. What are some things us non-coordinators, a subject librarian, can do to improve the lives and working conditions of our coordinators? Thank you for thinking about us. So I'm not sure who would like to take that.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I can add is maybe not expecting the instruction coordinator to take on the bulk of the teaching. That was a weird result that we heard often in our interviews. That it was like, well, they're the instruction coordinator. If I don't want to teach this class, or if I can't teach this class, they can do it. And I think that if we can avoid doing that, that would definitely make things easier for instruction coordinators. And there's more, I'm sure, but I'll let Joe jump in.
I don't know. I have some thoughts about that, but I also, I guess we've thought a lot about restructuring the position and how, again, structurally, this position could look different. And so, I don't like to say that that other teaching faculty, other teaching librarians should take on some of our work or some of our workload, because everybody is working so hard and no one has any time. And so that kind of question throws me a little bit, because we've thought so much about how the position is structured and sort of a top-down sort of way, that it's hard for me to also think about other people who are in our departments working really hard to do this work. And maybe the answer, or part of that answer, is opening up those conversations. Like, what is it about the work that you're doing that I can take on, or that we can take on? Again, maybe having some more general conversations in departments about the work we're doing and what we can do. Because I think a lot of coordinators tend to take on part of that work because they don't want other people in their department to have to take it on.
Thank you very much. We have reached our time. So before everybody goes, I want to just say that there will be a link to a feedback survey included in the session, and it will also be sent out via email. Oh, and the survey link is in the chat box now. Is there anything else to wrap up with?
No, I don't think so. I did see one comment about, following up on questions that maybe we didn't answer or didn't answer to your satisfaction. So I just put the title slide back up. It has both of our Twitter handles on there. Feel free to DM us or just shoot us a message, and we'll try and answer as best we can. It's kind of something that we're constantly thinking about and revising our thoughts on. It's a work in progress. So please do feel free to reach out.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for their time.
Thank you, Veronica and Joanna, for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Really appreciate the opportunity.
And I think that's it.
Great.
Good. Thank you.